If you ever took a canal holiday in Britain, the lock gates, the diesel engine, the pub at Stoke Bruern at sunset, the chances are the boat beneath you was a Springer. At its peak, Springer Engineering built more than 300 boats a year from a single yard in Market Harborough, nearly half of every narrowboat on the water. They survived the contempt of the boating establishment, which dismissed their boats as cheap, survived the founder's death, survived 3 changes of hands across 3 decades. And then, after 30 years of putting families on the water, the yard went silent. How does the most prolific narrowboat builder in British history simply vanish? What happened on Mill Hill Road? Chapter 1. The Tank Maker of Mill Hill. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with a man who never set out to build the thing he became famous for. Sam Springer, Samuel John Springer, arrived in Market Harborough sometime around 1957. He spoke with a London accent that never left him, an East End voice that Neil Arledge, who visited the works as a boy in 1972, would later describe as his familiar East End drool. He wasn't a boatman. He wasn't a canal enthusiast. He wasn't any kind of romantic about waterways or the English countryside. He was a steel tank fabricator, a man who knew how to cut plate, roll it, weld it, and make it hold water. That was his trade. That was what he was good at. And for the first decade of his time in Market Harborough, that's exactly what he did. Springer Engineering Sales operated from 34 High Street, with the works tucked away on Mill Hill Road. A 1959 advertisement in the Birmingham Daily Post laid out the offering plainly: arc welding, profile cutting, plate fabrication, constructional steelwork, and tank manufacture. By 1961, the Leicester Daily Mercury was carrying advertisements for Welland Metal Gates from the same firm. This was a classic post-war East Midlands metal-bashing operation, the kind of small, noisy, useful business that proliferated across the region in the years after the war, when there was steel to be worked and a country to rebuild. Sam made tanks, he made gates, he made whatever needed making from flat steel plate, and he made it well enough to keep the lights on and the welders employed. He'd married Dorothy in 1954, a Market Harborough comptometer operator who'd been widowed at 24 when her first husband, James Aitken, was killed in action in January 1942. Sam was 33, Dorothy 36, the genealogical research of the late Clive Reedman, who spent years piecing together the Springer family story before his own death, describes Sam at the time of his marriage as a dashing 33-year-old man about town who ran a thriving fabrication business at Mill Hill. That word, dashing, is almost the only glimpse of personality that survives beyond the work itself. Sam Springer didn't leave memoirs. He didn't give magazine interviews. He left 2 direct quotes to posterity, both of them about welding. The works on Mill Hill Road sat behind the Symington corset factory, itself a piece of Market Harborough's industrial heritage, the Victorian firm that had made Liberty bodices and foundation garments for decades. Jonathan Calder, who would later represent the ward as a Liberal Democrat councillor, remembered Mill Hill in the 1970s as a backwater hidden away behind Symington's corset factory, one of my favourite parts of my ward. It was the kind of street you'd pass through without noticing unless you had reason to be there. Corrugated iron sheds, brick buildings with no architectural ambition, a hard-standing yard, welders working in open bays, the smell of hot metal and flux. Mill Hill Road wasn't picturesque. It was functional, and functional for Sam Springer was the highest compliment a place could earn. There is a story, and the documentary must treat it as folk legend, because that's what it is, about how Sam Springer sourced his earliest steel. The Canal and River Trust's Waterfront magazine, in a 2016 piece by Peter Watts, concluded with the line, "Not bad for a company whose first boats were made from a scrapped gasometer." The detail has circulated orally in the Springer owner community for decades, that Sam, in the very earliest days, acquired decommissioned gas holders and flattened them with a truck to use as hull plate. The Springer Owners Facebook group, through its most determined researcher, a pseudonymous moderator who writes as Pogue Mahoney, flatly denies it, insisting that Sam's steel came from British Steel at Corby and stockholders in Nuneaton. Both versions probably contain a grain of truth. A tank maker working in scrap-era post-war Britain almost certainly used whatever plate came cheaply to hand. But by the time the boats were rolling out in any kind of volume, the steel was new, bought in, and British steel stamped. The gasometer is a founding myth, the kind of story a self-made man's legacy attracts. Part truth, part embellishment, entirely in character. Sam's father, Charles Springer, lived at 44 Roman Way, Market Harborough, and died on 12th of November 1963. That date matters. The winter of 1963 was the coldest Britain had endured since 1740. Canals froze solid, and on the canal network, already declining, already losing its commercial traffic to the roads, the freeze was the final blow. Boatmen who'd hung on through years of diminishing trade now abandoned their craft in the ice and went looking for paid work ashore. Hundreds of narrowboats were left where they sat. Their owners never came back. The year Sam Springer's father died, the commercial canal network effectively died with him. The waterways Sam would soon transform into a leisure industry were, in the winter of 1963, frozen corridors lined with abandoned boats and the ghosts of a working culture that had simply stopped. Sam didn't know it yet, but he was about to step into that silence. Chapter 2. A canal built for nobody. The canals hadn't always been dying. They'd been the subject of one of the most remarkable preservation campaigns in British history. A campaign that began, improbably, with a book, a letter, and a meeting on a narrowboat. L.T.C. Rolt, Tom Rolt, wrote narrowboat aboard his converted working narrowboat Cressy during 1939 and 1940, while the country was at war and the canals he was describing were slipping towards irrelevance. Published in December 1944 by Eyre and Spottiswoode, after a magazine extract caught the eye of the writer H.J. Massingham, the book described Rolt's journey through the canal system, the dying world of the working boatman, and the timeless landscape they moved through. It ran to multiple printings, and one of the letters it elicited came from Robert Aikman, a London literary agent and writer of supernatural fiction who would become, improbably, the most important canal campaigner in British history. The Rolts and the Aikmans met aboard Cressy at Tardebig's Top Lock on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal on 11 August 1945. Out of that meeting came the inaugural gathering of the Inland Waterways Association, held at Aikman's flat at 11 Gower Street, London, on 15 February 1946. Aikman as chairman, Charles Hadfield as vice-chairman, Tom Rolt as honorary secretary, Frank Eyre as treasurer. Their president was the writer and parliamentarian Sir A.P. Herbert. Their vice-president was the naturalist Peter Scott, whose wife, the novelist Elizabeth Jane Howard, served as part-time secretary from Aikman's flat. It was an extraordinary constellation of literary and public figures, united by a single conviction. Britain's canals were worth saving, not as museums, as living waterways. The IWA's first major boat rally was held at Market Harborough in August 1950. 120 boats and 50,000 visitors descended on Union Wharf, the canal basin, at the end of the lock-free 5.5-mile Market Harborough arm of the Grand Union Canal. That rally laid the foundation for the IWA National Festival, held almost every year from 1953 to 2013. Long before Sam Springer turned his hand to narrowboats, Market Harborough was already the spiritual capital of leisure boating in Britain. But the preservation movement's greatest practical achievement came elsewhere. David Hutchings, a driven, hands-on campaigner, led the restoration of the southern Stratford-upon-Avon Canal from March 1961, using volunteers from waterway societies, Boy Scouts, the armed services, and prisoners from Wormwood Scrubs and H.M. Prison Birmingham. By the summer of 1964, the canal bed had been cleared of 17,000 tons of rubbish, locks and bridges rebuilt, lake water supplies restored. The Queen Mother opened it on 11th of July 1964, in time for Shakespeare's 400th anniversary celebrations. It was the first wholesale canal restoration in Britain, and a proof of concept that changed everything. The framework was set. The Transport Act 1968 classified what remained of the canal network into commercial waterways, a handful of miles, cruiseways, the leisure spine, and remainder, everything else, with no statutory navigation rights. The commercial canals were finished, the leisure canals were just beginning, and what they needed, desperately, was boats that ordinary people could afford. This is where Sam Springer enters the canal story, not as a romantic, but as a man who spotted a gap in the market. In 1966, a separate Market Harborough firm called Harborough Marine based off Lexter Road, began building 40 to 50-foot steel narrowboats for a network of hire bases at Penkridge, Chorley, Gailey, Trevor, Whaley Bridge, and Market Harborough itself. This would become the foundation of the Anglo-Welsh hire fleet, a name that still trades today as one of the major canal hire operators. Harborough Marine needed steel fabrication work, sterns, end components, structural sections. They subcontracted Sam Springer. Sam's Mill Hill shop produced the steelwork using mass production rollers and jigs, the same techniques he'd developed making tanks. It was good, fast, reliable work. And then, according to the account preserved by the Pentagon researcher from the Harborough Advertiser of 8th of February 1968, Harborough Marine poached most of Sam's welders. Sam was more than a little peeved. His response was not to complain. It was to build his own boats, and in doing so, almost by accident, almost out of spite, he invented the modern leisure narrowboat. Chapter 3. The Tank Built Upside Down. The two surviving direct quotes from Sam Springer both describe the same thing. Neil Arledge, visiting the Mill Hill Works with his father in 1972, recorded the first. "We used to manufacture steel tanks. A narrowboat is a bit like that, but it works the other way round." Peter Watts, writing in the Canal and River Trust's Waterfront magazine in 2016, gave the second, "I used to build water tanks. Building boats is the same thing, but in reverse. They are textbook self-effacement. A tank is a steel box designed to keep water in. A narrowboat is a steel box designed to keep water out." Sam Springer saw no mystery in the distinction. He wasn't building vessels. He was building tanks, upside down. But there was more engineering in those tanks than the self-deprecation suggests. Sam designed his larger hulls with a 7-degree dihedral V bottom, not flat, but angled just enough to give the monocoque structure real rigidity. The Pentagon researcher traced this design detail to conversations Sam had had with retired hands in Woolwich and Greenwich dockyards. London shipbuilding practice, imported to a Leicestershire workshop by a man who'd grown up within earshot of the Thames. The V-hull was Sam's structural signature, and it's the reason original Springer hulls hold together decades later in ways that flat-bottomed copies from lesser builders don't. The earliest known Springer-built boat is provisionally dated 1966 and measures 30 feet. The first known Springer built complete for a private customer, Badger, dates from 1969 and was owned for many years by Glenn Peckett, who described it on the uk.rec.waterways forum as the oldest Springer in town. Badger is still in use. It has outlived its maker's company, and most of the criticism that was ever levelled at the boats Sam built. But the boat that changed everything, the one that turned Springer Engineering from a local fabricator into the most prolific narrowboat builder in Britain, was the Waterbug. 20 feet long, or 23, depending on the variant, built from 1/8-inch steel plate, 3.175 millimeters, throughout, a V-bottom hull, a foredeck well, a cruiser stern, a petrol outboard motor, usually a Honda or similar, 10 to 15 horsepower, nothing that required marine engineering qualifications to operate, and designed, with the precision of a man who understood tolerances, to fall exactly within the 1960s Road Traffic Act's allowable trailer envelope, 12 meters by 2.3 meters, 18 meters total tow rig length, with a 3-ton curb weight ceiling. That specification was the revolution. You could buy a Waterbug, hitch it to the back of the family Cortina, tow it home, park it on the drive, and slipway it onto your local canal for a weekend whenever the mood took you. No marina berth, no mooring fees, no diesel engine to maintain through the winter. Just a steel boat that lived in the garden and went on holiday with the family. The price tells the rest of the story. In 1972, Neil Arledge's father was quoted £3,675 for a complete fitted-out 36-foot, 4-berth cruiser-stern Springer narrowboat with a 10-horsepower Ducati diesel engine and all soft furnishings. That's roughly £52,000 in today's money. A fitted-out converted Fellows, Morton and Clayton working narrowboat, the Josher, that the boating establishment considered a proper boat, was £4,000 to £8,000 in the same year's money. Sam Springer was selling brand new, complete, ready-to-cruise narrowboats for less than the cost of converting somebody else's cast-off. And there was one more innovation that the boating world would eventually pretend had always existed. according to the Springer Owners Group's research, drawing on the 1974 Springer Prospectus, rediscovered in a 2016 house clearance, the cruiser stern, the large open rear cockpit with taff rails that defines the modern leisure narrowboat silhouette, was invented by Sam Springer in the mid-1970s for his larger boats. Every subsequent builder copied it. It became the default configuration for every narrowboat sold in Britain from the 1980s onward, and almost nobody knows that a tank maker from Mill Hill Road designed it. The Canal holiday, by the mid-70s, was becoming a recognisable part of British family life. Hire operators like Anglo-Welsh, Black Prince at Stoke Prior, and the various Hosaison's marketed fleets had established bases across the system. Waterways World, founded in January 1972, gave the growing community its own magazine. A week on a hired narrowboat was middlebrow, family-friendly, mildly adventurous. The lockwork blistered your hands, and the single-cylinder diesel chugged beneath your feet, and cheap relative to a hotel holiday. For a Midlands family in 1978 who couldn't afford Spain, a week from Foxton on a hired Springer was the summer. Sam Springer hadn't just built boats. He'd built the means by which ordinary British families accessed the canal network at all. The canals had been saved by campaigners. They were being maintained by the British Waterways Board, but they were being populated, filled with the traffic that justified their existence, by boats built on Mill Hill Road, Market Harborough, by a man who described his own work as a tank built upside down. Chapter 4. The Mill Hill Assembly Line. If you'd walked through the gates of Springer Engineering in the mid-1970s, past the corrugated iron sheds, past the open welding bays where arc light flickered blue-white against the brickwork, the first thing you'd have noticed was the noise. Not the roar of a heavy engineering works, not the foundry thunder of a steelworks, but the particular sharp crack and hiss of MIG welders running bead after bead of weld along steel plate. Underneath that, the grind of angle grinders' dressing seams, the clang of plate being dropped onto jigs, the diesel rattle of the small crane shifting hull sections from one station to the next, and threading through everything, the tinny transistor radio that was as much a fixture of a 1970s British workshop as the tea urn. The works sat on Mill Hill Road, behind Symington's corset factory, in what Jonathan Calder called a backwater, hidden from the town centre, invisible unless you knew it was there. A photograph posted to Flickr by user Mr. Sam, titled Sam Springer Engineering, see Mill Hill Premises, Market Harborough, shows what the central news footage from 1982 would later confirm. Brick and corrugated iron buildings, arranged without elegance around a hard-standing yard. No architectural ambition, no landscaping, no reception area with a potted plant and a company logo on the wall. This was a fabrication shop that happened to produce boats, and it looked like one. But the process inside those sheds was cleverer than the building suggested. Sam Springer had solved a problem that every boat builder faced: how to produce a bespoke product at volume without losing the customer-specific flexibility that made each boat saleable. His answer was mass production methodology applied to a craft industry. Preformed stern sections, radiused or angled depending on the model, were rolled in batches and held in stock. Bow components, roof panels and cabin-side sections were likewise produced in standard sizes and stacked ready for assembly. When an order came in, the hull was welded up on bare jigs from these standardized parts, plus customer-specific lengths of side plate, cut to the ordered length. The welders were Lloyd's certified, a detail the Springer community holds up like a talisman against every accusation of cheapness. These weren't casual fabricators running beads on thin plate. They were ticketed men whose welding met marine survey standards. The steel itself, 3/16 of an inch imperial plate on the bottom and sides of standard Springers, 1/8 inch on cabin sides and roof, was British steel plate from Corby, 20-odd miles up the road, or from stockholders in Nuneaton. Sam wasn't skimping on materials. He was building to a different standard than the one the purists would later insist was the only standard worth having. A completed hull, bare steel, welded, watertight, sitting heavy on its jig, then moved to fit out. Some boats were finished on site at Mill Hill: joinery, plumbing, electrics, engine installation. The standard engine in the early 70s was a Ducati 10-horsepower single-cylinder diesel, a small Italian marinized unit prized by those who owned them for sheer simplicity, and tolerated by those who didn't for its agricultural clatter. Lister single cylinders were the alternative, the iconic East Midlands Canal engine, a sound so distinctive that anyone who's heard one thumping across a still morning on the Grand Union can recall it 30 years later without effort. Later, boats took BMC 1.5 and 1.8 diesels, derived from Nuffield tractor units, and by the 80s the options had expanded to Thornycroft, Beta Marine, Kubota, and half a dozen others. But many springers left Mill Hill as shells, hulls without fit-out, driven away on temporary wheels, or floated out as bare steel, to be finished by Anglo-Welsh's own facility, by specialist fitters at Saul Junction on the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal, or by the buyers themselves. This is why surviving springers carry such an astonishing variety of roof structures: steel, plywood, GRP, and claimed timber. The hull was Sam's. The rest was whoever got their hands on it next. And then came the moment that Market Harborough's traffic learned to dread. A completed narrowboat, 40, 45, 50 feet of welded steel, had to get from Mill Hill Road to the canal. The works weren't at Union Wharf, the picturesque Grand Union Basin that served as the town's canal terminus. They were half a mile inland, behind the corset factory. So each finished boat was loaded onto a low-loader and driven through the streets of Market Harborough to the basin, where it was craned or slipped into the water. A 1970s amateur film, referenced in Jonathan Calder's 2013 blog post, captured this ritual: a springer being built at Mill Hill, transported through the town, and lowered into the canal basin to be fitted out. The Canal World Forum preserved the memory less fondly. I well remember Harborough traffic being brought to a standstill whenever a boat was squeezed from the factory and out onto the A427 St Mary's Road. At peak production, this wasn't an occasional event. It was a regular feature of Market Harborough life: 50 feet of narrowboat inching past the shops, the cars queuing, the pedestrians staring, the low-loader driver threading a steel hull through streets that were never designed for anything wider than a horse and cart. It was inconvenient. It was disruptive. And it was, for as long as it lasted, proof that something was being made here. Chapter 5. 400 a year. At some point in the mid to late 1970s, Springer Engineering crossed a threshold that no narrowboat builder had reached before or has reached since. The figures vary by source, as production figures for small private firms always do. Jones Boatyard's archived description claims 300 boats a year at peak, with 40% of the narrowboat market. Peter Watts, writing for the Canal and River Trust's Waterfront magazine in 2016, gave the higher estimate, 400 a year, accounting for almost 50% of the market. Bob Hakewill's Boat Builders of Market Harborough, the spiral-bound 56-page local history published by the Foxton Inclined Plane, Trust in 2010, that remains the canonical printed source, gives a total of approximately 3,000 boats between 1968 and the early 1990s. Take the conservative end, 300 a year. That's more than one boat for every working day. From a backwater yard behind a corset factory in a Leicestershire market town. By the early 1980s, the British Waterways Board counted more than 20,000 licensed boats on the canal network. Simple arithmetic says that at peak, 1 in every 4 or 5 boats afloat was a springer. You couldn't cruise the Grand Union, the Oxford, the Trent and Mersey, the Leeds and Liverpool, the Kennet and Avon. You couldn't cruise anywhere without passing one. The angular cruiser's stern, the slightly angled hull sitting a fraction differently in the water from the flat-bottomed boats around it. The name, if you looked, painted or stenciled somewhere on the steel: Springer, from Market Harborough. And with dominance came contempt. The boating establishment, Tom Rolt's intellectual heirs, the IWA's hardcore, the owners of converted Joshers and hand-built traditional sterns, looked at what Sam Springer had done and saw degradation. Mass-produced boats, not craftsman-built. 3/16 of an inch steel where they believed 10 millimeters was the minimum a proper boat required. Cruiser sterns with taffrails where a traditional narrowboat had a small back deck and a painted tiller. Petrol outboards on waterbugs where a real canal boat ran a Lister diesel. And, worst of all, the sin that could never be forgiven: finishing by amateurs. Shells sold to buyers who fitted them out themselves, with chipboard joinery and domestic plumbing and curtains from the high street, producing boats that varied wildly in quality and dragged the Springer name through every forum argument for the next 40 years. Cheap and cheerful was the polite version of what the purists called them. The less polite versions circulated on the towpath and in the bars of canal-side pubs, from Brownston to Stoke Bruern. The early hulls were accused of bowing in the middle and sticking in narrow locks, banana-shaped, in the dismissive shorthand of uk.rec.waterways. The mass production process was held against them as if volume were proof of carelessness. The steel thickness was treated as a moral failing, not an engineering choice. But there was a truth underneath the snobbery that the purists preferred not to examine. A converted fellow's Morton and Clayton working narrowboat, a josher, was the canal equivalent of a vintage Bentley. Beautiful, authentic, expensive to buy, expensive to maintain, and available only to those with the money and connections to find one. The boating establishment that sneered at Springers was an establishment that could afford not to need one. For a Midlands family on a single wage, the choice wasn't between a Springer and a josher. It was between a Springer and no boat at all. Nick Billingham, writing on uk.rec.waterways, put it with a plainness that Sam Springer himself might have appreciated. There might be an awful lot of sneering about Springers, but if they didn't exist, and we had to rely on people with $100,000 boats for the traffic that keeps the canals open, we probably wouldn't have any canals at all. So raise a glass to the memory of Springer engineering. I reckon that they had a special role in saving the canals by getting lots of people afloat. That was the argument, stated once, and it was unanswerable. The canal network existed as a leisure waterway because of the traffic upon it. The traffic existed because boats were available at prices ordinary people could pay. The boats were available because Sam Springer, working out of a corrugated iron shed behind a corset factory, had applied tank fabrication methods to narrowboat production and brought the price down to a point where boating wasn't a rich man's hobby. The purists who mocked the boats were standing on a network that the boats had kept alive. And the steel the purists called thin. The Pentagon researcher, the pseudonymous Pogue Muhone, moderator of the Springer Boats Facebook group, who has done more than any single person to rehabilitate Sam Springer's reputation, subjected his own 1973 Springer to ultrasound testing in 2011. 38 years of canal water, 38 years of mooring, of lock work, of British weather. The reading came back at 4.75 millimetres, original 3/16 of an inch plate, barely touched, no material loss worth measuring. The cheap steel outlasted the criticism. The budget boats kept floating. And Sam Springer, by the late 70s, was sitting at the summit of a business that had put more narrowboats on the water than any builder in history. He was also, though nobody on Mill Hill Road knew it yet, standing at the edge of a cliff. Chapter 6. The reins change hands. In 1979, Sam Springer retired. He was in his late 50s. He'd been building steel things on Mill Hill Road for more than 2 decades. Tanks, gates, and then the boats that had made his name mean something on every canal in Britain. He handed the business to his former manager. From 1979, the firm traded as P.J. Smith, trading as Springer Engineering. The Pentagon researcher's account is terse. From 1979, the farming out process was continued by P.J. Smith, trading as Springer Engineering, after Sam had retired and handed over the reins to his former manager. There is no record of a formal sale, no company's house filing for a transfer of ownership, because Springer Engineering, remarkably for a firm that had built approximately 3,000 boats, appears never to have been a registered limited company. It traded as a sole trader or partnership throughout its existence, a 3,000 boat manufacturer that never incorporated. That tells you something about Sam Springer's instincts, about the kind of business he ran, unfussy, immediate, resistant to the paperwork that larger firms treated as essential. It also tells you something about what happened next. A limited company has a board. It has articles. It has structures that survive the departure of any single person. A sole trader operation has the owner. When the owner steps back, the business becomes whatever the next person decides to make of it. P.J. Smith kept the name, kept the Mill Hill premises, kept the production methods, the rollers, the jigs, the preformed components, the Lloyd's certified welders, kept the customers. Many of them hire fleets ordering batches of shells for fit-out at their own facilities. On the surface, the handover was seamless. orders continued. Boats left Mill Hill Road and stopped traffic on St. Mary's Road. The Springer name stayed on the hulls. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Multiple forum accounts, Pentagon, the YBW Forum, UK.Rec.Waterways, converge on a shared observation. Springers built after Sam's tenure showed more variability, not catastrophically, not in ways that turned up in survey failures or structural collapses, but in the small details, the consistency of plate thickness, the precision of welded seams, the care taken in finish before a hull left the yard. Sam Springer had been a hands-on owner who personally toured customers around the works well into the 1970s. P.J. Smith was a manager running a production business. The difference was not one of competence, it was one of ownership, the difference between the man who built the thing and the man who inherited it. Sam Springer died in 1984. He was approximately 62. The claim comes from a single source, the Pentagon website, citing the genealogical research of the late Clive Reedman, and no independent obituary has been located in any public archive. The Harborough Advertiser may carry one. The GRO Death Index may confirm it. But as the record stands, the founder of Britain's most prolific narrowboat works died 5 years after stepping back from his creation, and nobody outside Market Harborough appears to have noticed. His widow Dorothy, who had likely run the firm's accounts in its earliest years, she was a trained comptometer operator. After all, a woman whose first husband had been killed in action and who had rebuilt a life around a fabrication shop on Mill Hill Road would have been about 66. What happened to her after Sam's death is unknown from the available sources. The documentary's production team should regard finding her story as a priority. Meanwhile, the Canal world that Sam had helped to create was changing around the business he'd left behind. Chapter 7. 6 weeks on Mill Hill. On 17th of November 1982, Central News, the ITV regional programme for the Midlands, broadcast a report by John Mitchell about a small boatyard in Market Harborough that was fighting for its life. Market Harborough Council had dug up the road at the top of the entrance to Springer Engineering's Mill Hill premises. Water mains and gas mains were being relayed simultaneously. The work had been going on for 6 weeks. For 6 weeks, the firm could not move goods, equipment, raw materials or finished narrowboats in or out of the yard. The access road, the only route between Mill Hill and the outside world, was an open trench. 4 employees had been made redundant as a direct result. The footage, held in the Mace archive, shows what you'd expect from a regional news crew visiting a Midlands light industrial yard in 1982. A welder at work in an open bay, general views of the premises, the corrugated iron sheds, and hard standing that were Springer Engineering's daily reality. 2 men were interviewed on camera. Les Smith, identified as a boat builder at Springer Engineering, described the 6 weeks of blocked access and the unsuitable alternative route the council had offered. His surname matches P.J. Smith, trading as Springer Engineering, strongly suggesting that Les and P.J. were the same family, perhaps brothers, perhaps the same man under different given names. The connection has never been formally established, but the coincidence is pointed enough that the documentary should investigate it. Harold Silliphant, Market Harborough Council Chief, confirmed on camera that the water and gas mains had to be relayed at the same time. He refused to entertain compensation, either for the firm or for the 4 men who'd lost their jobs. The council's position was straightforward. The mains needed doing, the mains were being done, and the consequences for any business unfortunate enough to sit at the end of the road being dug up were not the council's problem. 4 men, 4 redundancies. In the larger narrative of British industrial decline, where the numbers run to tens of thousands, where entire coalfields and shipyards and steel towns were hollowed out, 4 jobs barely registers. But Springer Engineering was not British steel. It was not a nationalised industry with a government minister deciding its fate. It was a small private firm in a market town, employing perhaps 15 to 25 people at that date, and it had just lost a quarter of its production capacity because the local council decided to dig up the road. This is the documentary's gold standard archive sequence, not because of the scale of the disaster, but because of the banality of it. The decline of British manufacturing is usually told as a story of global forces, of Thatcherism, of foreign competition, of underinvestment over generations, and those stories are real. But there is another story, quieter and less dramatic, about the small decisions that nibbled away at small firms in small towns, a council that didn't coordinate its roadworks, a 6-week closure that nobody at the town hall thought to plan around, 4 men who went home and didn't come back, Harold Silliphant, on camera, refusing to pay for what his council had done. Not malice, not ideology, just the ordinary indifference of local government to the businesses it was supposed to serve. Springer Engineering survived the 1982 crisis. The road was eventually repaired. The yard reopened. Boats resumed their progress through the streets of Market Harborough. But the firm was smaller by 4 men, and smaller by the 6 weeks of production it had lost, and smaller by whatever margin of resilience a business needs to absorb a blow and keep going without flinching. And the blow had landed at exactly the wrong time. Chapter 8. The Rolls-Royce of the Cut. Through the 1980s, the narrowboat market underwent a transformation that would have been unrecognizable to Sam Springer. The shift happened in 2 movements, and both of them pointed in the same direction, away from everything Springer Engineering had been built to do. The first was the liveaboard revolution. Through the 1970s, narrowboats had been overwhelmingly holiday boats. You bought one, or more commonly, you hired one, for a week or a fortnight on the canal, and then you went home. The boat was recreation. It was not a dwelling. But by the mid-1980s, a growing number of people were living aboard their narrowboats, permanently or semi-permanently, retired couples, young professionals priced out of the housing market, people who'd chosen a different kind of life. The numbers would grow steadily. By the time the Canal and River Trust began counting seriously, approximately 8,580 narrowboats were registered as permanent homes on Britain's waterway system. A holiday boat and a home are not the same thing. A family spending a week on a hired 36-footer doesn't need double glazing, doesn't need a multi-fuel stove with a back boiler feeding radiators, doesn't need a full-size domestic cooker, a walk-in shower, solid oak joinery, a king-size bed in a dedicated sleeping cabin, and enough 12-volt battery capacity to run a television, a laptop, and a washing machine simultaneously. A liveaboard does, and a liveaboard needs a hull that will last 30, 40, 50 years in the water without overplating, which means 10 millimeters of steel on the base plate, 6 to 8 on the sides, 6 on the cabin, 4 to 6 on the roof. Not 3/16 of an inch, not 1/8 of an inch, 10 millimeters. The second movement was the rise of the bespoke builder, where Sam Springer had applied factory logic to boat production, standardized components, jig-welded hulls, volume efficiency. A new generation of builders was doing the opposite. One boat at a time, designed to the buyer's specification, hand-finished, named. Steve Hudson, working out of Glascote Basin in Tamworth, was the man who came to embody the new standard. His boats were the Rolls-Royces of the cut, a phrase the narrowboat community used without irony. Traditional sterns, heavy steel, oak interiors, every boat built as if Hudson's own name were riding on it, which it was. The price reflected it. A Hudson in the mid-1990s commanded £80,000 to £100,000. A Springer of similar length, second-hand and finished by its owner, was £15,000 to £25,000. The market had bifurcated, and the top half was where the money, the prestige and the future had gone. Roger Fuller at Stone, Jonathan Wilson and Tim Tyler, whose Tyler-Wilson partnership built premium shells, Norton Keynes Boat Builders, Stephen Goldsborough, Sterling Narrowboats. None of these firms competed on price. All of them defined themselves, explicitly or implicitly, against the mass production model that Springer represented. The new buyer wanted to know the name of the man who'd welded the hull, wanted to walk through the workshop and see their boat taking shape, wanted the kind of relationship with the builder that Sam Springer had once offered his own customers, personal, hands-on, direct, but wrapped in a product that was heavier, thicker, more expensively finished, and built to last a lifetime rather than a holiday season. The YBW Forum's summary of the transition is blunt. As the market developed and matured, the emphasis moved from relatively affordable mass-produced boats to fairly standard designs towards boats built to order, and then finally towards high-end bespoke one-offs. Today, you won't find anybody mass-producing narrowboats. And the Forum's verdict on the late-era Springers is equally direct. The later 1990s Springers built after Sam Springer passed away did, in common with many other late-build mass-produced boats, have steel quality problems. Not because the welding was bad, not because P.J. Smith or his successors had forgotten how to build boats, but because the cheap and cheerful model, the entire Springer philosophy of volume production at accessible prices, demanded cutting margins tighter as competition from premium builders intensified. The boats that came off the line in the late 80s weren't the boats that Sam had built in the mid-70s. The difference wasn't always visible, but it was there. British waterways tightened the screw from the regulatory side. The boat safety scheme, increasingly mandatory through the 1990s, imposed safety standards and survey requirements that raised the running cost of every boat on the system, but bit harder on a budget water bug than on a 60-foot luxury liveaboard. Licensing fees climbed, insurance costs rose. The economics of cheap boating were changing, and every change favoured the expensive end of the market over the accessible end. Britain itself was changing. The country entered recession in late 1990. The exchange rate mechanism crisis built through the summer of 1992 and exploded on Black Wednesday, 16th of September 1992, when interest rates briefly hit 15% and the pound crashed out of the ERM. Discretionary spending collapsed. New boat orders evaporated. The early 1990s recession was a documented graveyard of small British manufacturing businesses, and although no source directly ties Springer's final collapse to specific post-ERM events, the chronology fits with the grim precision of a lock gate closing. The market Sam Springer had created, the budget narrowboat for the ordinary family, was being squeezed from every direction. Premium builders above, regulators below, a recession underneath. And inside the firm, the founder was 5 years dead, the brand was in its third set of hands, and the boats leaving the yard were further from Sam's original standard with every passing year. Chapter 9. The Steel Bottle and the Silence. There is one more Springer story to tell before the end, and it is perhaps the strangest of all. In 1990, Springer Engineering built the Typhoon Atlantic Challenger, a 37-foot scarlet bottle-shaped steel vessel commissioned by Tom McLean, a former SAS soldier and survival expert who had previously rowed the Atlantic solo in 1969 and lived on the Rock of Rockall in 1985 to affirm Britain's territorial claim. McLean's idea was to cross the Atlantic inside the world's smallest ocean-going vessel, a steel bottle built by the same Mill Hill workshop that had spent 25 years producing Canal narrowboats for the English Midlands. The vessel was pure Springer engineering, welded steel plate, shaped and sealed and launched into an ocean rather than a canal. McLean sailed it from New York to Falmouth in 37 days at 3.5 knots, sleeping sideways for 90 minutes a night because the rolling wouldn't allow any other position, with an oak four-poster bed inside that he could never properly use. He arrived in Falmouth in mid-August 1990. The crossing raised $950,000 for the National Children's Home, a charity caring for orphans in Britain. The boat is now displayed outside the underwater centre at Fort William, a steel bottle built by a tankmaker's firm in a Leicestershire market town that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. The same company that started, allegedly, by flattening gasometers, ended by sending a pressure vessel across 3,000 miles of open water. It was the last triumphant thing Springer Engineering ever did. By the time Tom McLean reached Falmouth, the firm was already in its terminal phase. The final ownership had passed to Carol and Steve Green, named only in the Jones Boatyard description, with no corroborating source for their full identities or the precise dates of their tenure. The Greens made a decision that, on paper, looked rational. They moved the company out of the cramped, awkward, access-challenged Mill Hill premises and into a new factory on the Welland Industrial Estate, adjacent to Rockingham Road. A purpose-built unit, proper access, modern facilities, everything the Mill Hill Yard had lacked. The Canal World Forum's recollection, posted by Quo Vadis in December 2011, records the outcome with the quiet economy of someone who already knows how the story ends. Latterly, they moved to a nice new factory on the Welland Industrial Estate adjacent to Rockingham Road, but went under soon after. A nice new factory, but went under soon after. The Greens had invested in new premises at the worst possible moment, during a recession, in a market that was migrating away from everything their firm produced. The move from Mill Hill was the right decision for a growing business. Springer Engineering was not a growing business. It was a contracting business in a contracting market segment, and the cost of a new factory on an industrial estate consumed whatever margin of survival remained. No national press covered the closure. No Waterways World obituary has been located online. No Harborough advertiser receivership notice has surfaced in the publicly available record. Springer Engineering, the firm that had produced more narrowboats than any other builder in British history, the firm whose output constituted nearly half the boats on the Canal network at peak, simply stopped. The available estimates cluster around 1993. Wilton Marina says approximately 1992. Jones Boatyard says mid-90s. Surviving boats are dated as late as 1993. Bergwyn again, a 29-foot cruiser stern sold years later by River Canal Rescue. Production effectively ceased around 1993. The formal closure of the trading business followed, probably 1994 or 1995. Nobody recorded the last boat. Nobody preserved the last day. The welders went home. The jigs sat empty. The rollers stopped. And the silence that settled over the Welland Industrial Estate unit was the kind of silence that shouldn't be there. The silence of a place built for noise, occupied by nothing. Chapter 10. Housing where the hulls were. Mill Hill Road, LE16, 7DN, is housing now. Land registry data shows 51 property sales in the postcode since 1995. The timing is consistent with redevelopment beginning in the mid-1990s, almost exactly coinciding with the end of Springer Engineering's existence. The wider Symington Corset Factory District has been redeveloped as the Symington Building and Symington Way, a mixed-use scheme. The surrounding streets are residential, brick and render, driveways and wheelie bins. The corrugated iron sheds are gone. The welding bays are gone. The hard standing where narrowboat hulls sat on their jigs waiting for plate is under someone's patio. There is no plaque on Mill Hill Road, no marker, no heritage board with a photograph and a paragraph about the firm that once operated here. 3,000 narrowboats were built on this ground, more than any other single yard in British canal history, and the only evidence that anything industrial ever happened here is the shape of the street itself, which still carries the slightly too wide curve of a road that was once used to swing steel hulls onto low loaders. The Welland Industrial Estate Unit, the nice new factory that was Springer's final home, is presumably occupied by another light industrial tenant. No successor has been identified. Union Wharf, the canal basin where the finished boats were slipped into the water, has been transformed. The red brick warehouses are apartments. The waterfront restaurant and bar overlooks the basin. Boutique Narrowboats has operated a hire fleet from the wharf since 2019. Union Wharf Narrowboats runs day boats. The basin is picturesque, busy, and entirely disconnected from the industrial story that once fed it. You can sit on the terrace at the waterfront with a glass of wine and watch narrowboats glide past the spot where Sam Springer's hulls were craned into the water, and there is nothing, not a word, not an image, not a nameplate, to tell you that this is where Britain's canal leisure industry was born. Steve Hudson, whose name became synonymous with the premium narrowboat that replaced the Springer at the top of the market, died on 2nd December 2014. Sarah and Graham Edgson's Norton Keynes boat builders moved into Hudson's Glascote Basin premises in June 2015. The bespoke tradition that had helped kill the mass production model continued from the same workshop under new hands. The luxury end of the market that Springer had inadvertently created carried on without the firm that had made it possible. But the Springers, the boats themselves, carried on too. Hackwill's total of approximately 3,000 boats built, and the boating community's consistent estimate that the great majority remain either afloat or in existence on hard standing, suggests that 70 to 90% of the original output survives. Open Apollo Duck on any given day, and you'll find dozens of Springers for sale, from £8,000 project boats with peeling paint and a seized engine to £25,000 well-maintained 45-foot cruiser sterns with solid engines and warm cabins. Badger, the 1969 boat that Glenn Peckett called the oldest Springer in town, is still in use, 57 years old and counting. Pentagon, the 1973 36-footer that gave the Springer community's most determined researcher his pseudonym, has been through the Bristol Channel, the Avon Gorge, the Thames Estuary, and Dartford Creek. saltwater passages that would test boats, built to standards the purists considered respectable. It came through with its original 3/16-inch plate intact. Diesel the Miller, a 27-foot Springer, sank at its moorings in Saddleworth during the 2018 Beast from the East when ice expanded against the hull. Its owner, a different Sam, recovered it. The boats sink. They come back. They persist with a stubbornness that mirrors the stubbornness of the man who designed them. The Springer Boats group on Facebook is the living community. Several thousand members, moderated by, among others, the author of Pentagon 60906.co.uk. The researcher, whose anonymous, tireless archival work has done more to preserve Sam Springer's story than any heritage organisation, any museum, any council plaque that was never installed. The group unearthed the 1974 Springer prospectus from a house clearance in 2016, the closest surviving thing to a Sam-era brand document. They pushed back against the 2016 waterfront article that the Pentagon researcher dismissed as condescending horseshit. They documented hull numbers, identified surviving boats, mapped the fleet. They did what Market Harborough Council never did. They remembered. Chapter 11. What the cheap boats proved. The canal network that Sam Springer helped to populate now carries more than 34,000 licensed boats. The Canal and River Trust manages 2,000 miles. Continuous cruiser liveaboards increase year by year. The Canal holiday, dormant for a generation, has experienced something of a revival in the age of slow travel and digital detox. The waterways are busier than they have been in decades, but the market that Springer served has gone. The budget narrowboat, the boat you could buy on a single wage, the boat that put your family on the water for less than a fortnight in Spain, doesn't exist anymore. A new 60-foot narrowboat from a named builder now costs north of £150,000. The entry point for a usable second-hand boat has climbed into the tens of thousands. Boating has become what it was before Sam Springer arrived, a pursuit for people with means. What was lost when Springer Engineering went silent was not just a factory, it was a class of access. The cheap canal holiday, like the package holiday to the Costa Brava, the Butlins Chalet Week, the family car that cost a year's wages rather than 3, was a piece of post-war working-class British leisure that the late 20th century quietly priced out. Sam Springer's boats were the canal network's equivalent of the Cortina, mass-produced, sneered at by enthusiasts, and owned by more families than the prestige Marquez could ever reach. The boats are still there, thousands of them, chugging past the boat inn at Stoke Bruern, squeezing through the narrow locks at Foxton, moored two abreast on the Oxford Canal with a barbecue smoking on the towpath and children's bikes leaning against the tiller. 40 years old, 50 years old, 3/16 of an inch steel, and still floating. A tank maker from the East End built them on a back street behind a corset factory in a town that has forgotten he was ever there. He called his boats tanks built upside down. The boating establishment called them cheap. The canal network called them essential, 3,000 boats, and nobody put up a plaque.